Hi everyone, nice to see you again. Welcome back to the channel. Today I would like to talk on a subject that is close to my heart. Is it possible to demonstrate with a high degree of accuracy, reliability, your abilities with a language by sitting in front of a camera and talking into it? This is something that we see very commonly on YouTube, of course, especially from the polyglots who are trying to impress upon people that they can speak 97 different languages and that they learn each one in 3 weeks or some nonsense like that. That sort of cynicism to one side, it is quite an interesting question conceptually. If somebody sits in front of a camera and talks into it, can we tell in the final analysis how good they are at the language in question? My answer is essentially no, we can't, but that has to be qualified. Of course, it's the case that you can get some information about how people speak a language just by listening to them speak it into a camera. I mean, you're watching a video in which I'm speaking English into a camera, and you would be fairly surprised to discover, I think, or if you were to discover that I cannot actually speak English properly, you would be quite surprised. You would think, wow, Sam really acted that out well. His pronunciation really sounded native-like. He really had me fooled for a minute there. You would be surprised if I turned out to be someone who couldn't speak English properly. But normally when people are trying to demonstrate their abilities with foreign languages, of course they don't speak them the way I'm speaking English into this camera at the moment. They don't speak this freely. They can't speak this freely. And that is the type of thing that we are going to look at now. First and foremost, when people are talking into a camera, they get multiple takes, and they get editing, and they can chop out the bad stuff and the stuff that went wrong. Now, we do this when we're making videos in our own languages. I do that when I make videos in English. I'll edit this to some extent later, chop out things that didn't come out right, things that I stumbled over, etc., etc. But the point is that this sort of editing, this sort of utilization of multiple takes can obviously be used deceptively. When I edit these videos, I don't do it to try and impress upon you the fact that I can speak English. We already know that I can speak English. I just do it to make the videos smoother and more coherent. If you do this stuff in a more deceptive sense, then you can create some very serious false impressions. Secondly, and I know I'm stating the obvious here, people can simply script things. Obviously, I've thought about what's going into this video. I don't just sit down in front of a camera and start talking on the whole, but this is not scripted. I don't have a text. I'm not reading from a text. People can use some sort of crude, impromptu auto cue. They can memorize lines in advance. They can do all sorts of things to give a false impression, right, as to how well they can speak the language that they're speaking. Perhaps more importantly, even when people are speaking freely, spontaneously, without any sort of text, there are other factors at work that will falsely inflate our notions of how well they can speak the language in question. Firstly, people get to choose what they talk about, right? And very often people are just droning on about language learning. So you'll get 50 words in Russian about how someone learned Russian, then 50 words in Spanish about how someone learned Spanish. People are choosing to speak about the things where they have a lot of very well-rehearsed expressions and sentence patterns that are of use in those contexts. If you ask one of those people to describe a view or some scenery to you, if you show them a photograph and ask them to describe what's in it, then the chances are they're going to start to struggle quite badly. Another very important factor is that when people are just talking into a camera, there's no interaction, right? There's no interaction with another human being. People don't get interrupted. They don't get asked questions that they're not expecting. They don't have to deal with people breaking their train of thought in any sense. It always seems to me that when we sit in front of a camera and speak like this, or whenever we engage in any sort of extended monologue, and this is just a feeling, right? This is speculation on my part. But I think that to some extent our brains are preparing the next sentence in advance, put it like that. We can prepare stuff in advance and ease ourselves from one sentence to the next, to the next, to the next. Because I do feel that we're plotting the course that our monologue is going to take to some extent, even when we don't realize that we're doing that. Real interaction means that our brains have to formulate sentences, questions, whatever you like, very quickly when they were not expecting to have to formulate them, when they had no way of knowing in advance that they would have to formulate them. And that is a much more challenging cognitive activity, and that is precisely what you do not get when people are speaking into cameras. That's something that even I am not being required to do right now. What I'm doing, in one sense, is much easier than having a real conversation. There's no interaction here. I don't have to process anything that anyone else is saying. Don't have to formulate anything unexpectedly, right? And that is the biggest problem with these videos, where people just plonk a camera down and talk into it. There's no interactive element. And the ability of the brain, like I said, to roughly plot out a few seconds in advance the course of what is going to be said, roughly, makes a huge difference to our perception of how well someone can speak the language that they're speaking. So my point basically is that if you want to get a balanced take on how well someone can speak a language, and speaking always implies listening comprehension too, right? Because if you can't understand what people say to you, what kind of conversation can you have? Anyway, if you want to get a balanced view of how well someone can actually speak a language, whatever language it may be, then you have to observe them having a real, completely unscripted, completely unprepared conversation, in which people do all the things that human beings really do when they converse. People laugh, they make jokes, they interrupt each other, they backtrack, they zip from one subject to another unexpectedly. People go back to something that they were talking about a minute ago, then abandon that halfway through and move to something else. This sort of stuff is going on all the time. And if you don't get access to people doing this, then you don't really get access to their true level of ability. The other point I would make is that you are going to have to listen to a relatively lengthy conversation. If you want to gauge someone's true level, you're going to have to listen to a relatively lengthy conversation in which the topic under discussion varies unpredictably. People spend a few minutes catching up and asking how the other person is doing. Then they talk about, hell, I don't know, the war in Ukraine or this political and civil collapse in Sudan. Then they start talking about a storm that they were forced to endure the day before. Then they start talking about a holiday they're going to go on, and then a book they're reading, and then maybe they talk about something else. You've really got to hear people range across different subjects. I would be incredibly skeptical, I always am incredibly skeptical, of people who just talk about the same very limited number of subjects and all the different languages that they speak. You will have noticed, I am sure, that all of these so-called polyglots on YouTube have a very strong tendency, I'm not saying it's an absolute rule, but they have a very strong tendency just to talk about language learning and how they learnt this language and how they learnt that language. And I am extremely suspicious of the claims of competence that people make when they just talk about the same thing all the time.